In a recent op-ed for the Washington Post, President Obama spoke on the subject of solitary confinement, said that we needed to reconsider our policies in that area, and proposed some changes, announced some changes that he was going to be making in terms of juvenile justice and solitary confinement. Our next guest, Marc Schindler, is the executive director of the Justice Policy Institute, and he's here to discuss that op-ed with us and overall what we need to do about solitary confinement in this country. Marc Schindler, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So you guys wrote a response, you guys at the Justice Policy Institute, which is, by the way, at justicepolicy.org. People can find it. You guys wrote a response to President Obama's op-ed on the subject of rethinking solitary confinement. What was your reaction?
So we are just applauding the president for his action. We think it's a terrific step in the right direction. Solitary confinement is a practice that is deeply damaging to young people and adults, but particularly young people, and we've seen evidence of that for years. And so the president's action is a terrific statement at the national level, gives voice to what is happening all over the United States, around the country. So we think it's terrific and a terrific.
So let me ask you then. I mean, that's great news to hear you say that. What precisely does the Justice Policy Institute do? You basically are a group, for listeners who don't know, you're a group that pushes for more humane policies in this area, right?
That's correct. The Justice Policy Institute, or JPI, if you will, is a national research and policy organization. We work on both juvenile justice and criminal justice issues, and we encourage fairer and more effective policies that would result in fewer people being incarcerated and more people receiving what they need in the community, where we believe, and research shows, they get better outcomes and we'll have safer communities.
So now the president's op-ed basically, as I read it, had two messages in it. One was overall about the wisdom of solitary confinement as a technique, as a law enforcement technique within prisons, and that was a broader, as I read it, a broader statement of concern and a call to reconsider the use of solitary confinement. And then specifically the action that the president announced addressed juvenile solitary confinement. Is that correct?
That is correct. So he gave a overarching statement about the use of solitary confinement generally, and this isn't the first time he's talked about this issue, and looked at what's going on nationally and the harms that we see from that practice. And specifically, he took executive action as it relates to young people, juveniles in federal custody. Now, it's important to understand that there are a limited number of juveniles in the federal system, in federal custody. So it's great for those young people, but the majority, the great bulk of young people who are in juvenile justice facilities around the country are in state and local facilities. And from his vantage point at the federal level, he can't directly order those facilities to change their practice, but clearly he is making a statement, and we believe it will have influence at the state and local level as well.
What about so this is essentially affecting a minority of the people, of the young people in prison, but as you say, it's also a message to the country that hopefully will affect policies at the state and local level as well. But it also, in terms of specific action, as I understand it, and we're talking with Marc Schindler, Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute, on the Zero Hour, as I understand it, it does not address, the President's order does not address adult solitary confinement. And my sense of solitary confinement as a practice is that as a matter of international law, it's functionally something akin to torture.
That's correct. That's correct. And so his statement, again, he's using the bully pulpit, and we think in a good way. And he was taking a step absolutely in the right direction as it regards to young people. He's also encouraging us to look at this issue more broadly, including for adults. And so when you think of how this can play out, in particularly in the juvenile justice context. So yes, I'm currently the executive director of the Justice Policy Institute, but I also spent 6 years helping to run the district's juvenile justice agency, a local city agency that incarcerated young people, and at that time did use, although we limited it greatly, solitary confinement of young people. What the president is doing is saying young people in federal custody will no longer be subject to solitary confinement, and what he also can do, what the federal government can do, is provide resources and technical assistance through the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice to state and local agencies and systems so that they can achieve the same types of goals. So when I was a director of the district's juvenile justice agency, we made use of technical assistance and resources from the federal government to help us with our work. Our hope is that the federal government, the federal agency, Office of Juvenile Justice, will follow up in terms of implementation of the president's comments and make resources and technical assistance available to state and local administrators so that they can achieve this same goal that he has directed as it relates to the federal system.
Is there, that's an excellent point, and is there also executive action that the president might be able to take regarding adult prisoners and solitary confinement?
He could. And so that is clearly a much bigger piece of the puzzle as it relates to the federal system. So the federal correction system, the Bureau of Prisons incarcerates 200,000 people in federal prisons, and they do use solitary confinement. So, by his statements, the hope is that they will limit, but he did not order, similar to what he did for juveniles. I think that he is taking a step in the right direction, and I think they are looking at how this plays out. I'm sure there are discussions going on at the top levels about how they can also address this at the adult level. I think he took a step that was, in the federal context, I think operationally manageable in the near term, and I wouldn't be surprised if he is encouraging and pushing the Federal Bureau of Prisons to make progress in this area as well, short of ordering through executive action.
Now, Marc Schindler of the Justice Policy Institute, I'm going to take a slight risk here because I haven't studied the history of prisons in this country in a long time, but I think the very concept of solitary confinement may go back to the notion, the old British notion and colonial notion of the prison as penitentiary, as a place where people reflect and, kind of a religious undertone, that people are isolated in cells where they can reflect on their bad behavior, which of course in practice has worked out to be nothing of the kind, but it's an old tradition in this country, isn't it?
Well, I think that's right, and not just here, but internationally as well. But I think in the days that you're referring to, when it was thought of in terms of a place to reflect, clearly we've come a long way in a bad way since then. And so, when we think of corrections in this country writ large, it's really in many ways a misnomer to refer, particularly to adult correction systems, as corrections, because it's really about punishment and incapacitation. And the use of solitary confinement in these facilities, particularly in the adult setting, but also in the juvenile setting, has really moved far away from those long ago motivations, and really is about punishment and incapacitation. And of course, we can't have this conversation without realizing that a disproportionate number of people who are impacted in these facilities are poor, and particularly poor people of color. So when if you went to juvenile facilities around the country and looked at who was being held in solitary confinement, you would by and large see many black and brown faces. In the federal system, you would see mostly Native American youth. And so we have to understand that the racial implications of these practices are intertwined with how we got on. And unfortunately, the bad place we are in this country in terms of prison conditions and the way we handle adults and young people. We're making some progress, and we're seeing some places that are doing much better. The Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, which is the organization that works with state directors of juvenile justice around the country, are really doing excellent work on helping their constituency, their members, to develop alternatives so that they don't place youth in solitary confinement and isolation. That's a terrific sign and good progress, and we've got work to do. And I think the president's statement will help us move forward in that direction.
And I think it's important for listeners to understand. I mean, I think there's a certain reaction some people have. Well, solitary confinement is just being alone. There's nothing so terrible about, it's like a timeout, or they picture it as a timeout or something. I think it's important for people to understand. I appreciate your use of the word incapacitation, because my belief is that the studies have shown not only is it an extremely inhumane and harmful practice, but it really degrades people's ability to function if it's, once it goes on too long, that it really makes it very difficult, as many aspects of our prison system do, for people to reintegrate themselves into society, which should be the goal.
That's absolutely right. And when we think of, so incapacitation and punishment, I don't want to lose that word as well.
Sure.
And I think for your listeners and viewers out there, to sort of get a sense of how this actually plays out, obviously not exactly, but think of going into a room roughly the size of your bathroom, maybe a little bit larger, and being locked in that space with just nothing to occupy your time. Right? So I'd encourage folks just to go in and stay there for a while, and think about 3 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours, 24 hours, or longer, what that does to your state of mind, right? And then think about the young people who are in those settings, who are during a time of adolescence, which is a challenging time anyway. And many of these young people already have had trauma in their lives or have some type of disability. Some have a mental health issue. And think about how that plays out. It's the exact opposite of what we should be doing with young people and adults if we want them to be on a better trajectory. So it's a counterproductive approach. And I think people are realizing that, and the president spoke to that, I think, very powerfully.
Yeah, I think it's counterproductive. I also think I think it's inhumane and unbefitting a civilized country. So I appreciate very much your work in this area at the Justice Policy Institute, and Marc Schindler, Executive Director. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
My pleasure. Good to talk with you.
Same here.